So what I'm going to talk to you about today is kind of this idea I've been having recently. Just a second. So I want to talk to you about this idea I've been having recently, where I've been noticing a lot of similarities between the frameworks that we use on the internet to make web apps and websites as well and stuff like that. There's a lot of similarities, and we spend a lot of time flame warring with each other, trying to decide whether we should use React or whether we should use Vue or, God forbid, Angular. So we spend a lot of time doing that, but what if deep down they're actually all the exact same thing and they achieve the same things in slightly different ways? So that's kind of what we're going to explore today, and I'm going to try to make it sort of almost like a group discussion because I'm interested in what your guys' opinions are as well. So if you have anything to say, just either start shouting, jumping up, raise your hands, whatever you want, as long as you get my attention, and we're basically going to see what happens. This is my first time presenting this idea in a public forum, and it's almost like a request for comments sort of thing. Ben already mentioned a lot about me, but this is what I look like if you didn't figure out from my face. You can find a lot of my stuff on swizzes.com/blog, and the reason I'm not directing you to the domain itself is because I haven't updated it in 3 years, and I really need to. It's one of those things where, it's like, oh, I'm going to have time next week. I'm going to update my homepage. And then it's 2 years later, and you still haven't updated your homepage. Who here has a homepage that they're neglecting? There we go. Awesome. So, first things first, we're at a React meetup. How many people here are React engineers or developers? Awesome. How many of you have tried Vue or Ember or Angular? Almost all of you. Perfect. So, first thing, I can't for the life of me find the source of this quote, but somebody that I follow on Twitter, who is relatively Twitter famous, once said that, I think this was when Vue started being popular and kind of overtaking React, and suddenly everybody was saying, oh, hey, React is this old school thing from 2014, and Vue is the new thing because React has patents and shit. So we're just going to all transfer to Vue, and then React stopped having patents, and now we're in this weird state where React is still cool, and React 16 came out, which is even cooler, but a lot of people are saying that Vue is very cool, and it's kind of confusing. It almost seems like, I think from when I became a web developer, probably every year or every 2 years, we get a new framework that says it's the best framework since ever, and we have to all switch to start using that, right? Does anyone else notice that? Right. So somebody said that with React, what we got were components, and it doesn't really matter. In the next 10 years, we don't know what React is going to look like because it's in active development, things are happening, and we don't know if it's even still going to be React. Maybe we are all going to switch to Vue, but what's definitely going to happen is that we are going to be using components for a very long time to come. So if you take anything out of my talk today, what I want you to take out is that you shouldn't focus on learning frameworks, learning specific frameworks and how specific things do stuff. You should focus more on thinking in components, thinking in these unidirectional data flows and stuff like that. Because those are the core concepts that I think are going to stay with us for a long time. It's the same as, I like to say that React, when I first saw it, felt to me as big of a revolution as jQuery was way back in 2007 was it? So what jQuery gave us was a uniform way of talking to the DOM, and suddenly our life was better. We could do everything with jQuery. Then eventually React came along, and it was like, whoa, we don't even have to think about the DOM. You just have to think about the sort of abstract concept of how your app is structured and how your app comes together. So, what was I going to say next? Let's just go to the next slide. Does anyone remember this picture? Who here has seen this picture before? Almost everyone. So this is from the original, I think it's from the original Flux docs. So when React came out, they had this idea that we're going to be using Flux as a implement. I think they called it a implementation principle or something like that, of which Redux became the most popular actual implementation. The idea is that you have these actions that get dispatched on your entire thing, and you have a global data store, and all of your app listens to the data store at the same time. The data store then passes your data into the view, and the view re-renders itself. If the view wants to do anything, it kind of goes in this loop back to the dispatcher, and everything goes in a nice circle, right? I'm sure we've all played with this before. We've all done it. And since this is a React meetup, I'm sure we all pretty much understand how this works. Now, here's the tricky question. This is I guess this is not the tricky question. The next one is going to be tricky. This is the same flow, except now it's in Redux. Dan Abramov simplified it a little bit. Here we have these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different buckets. Oh, you look like you have a question.
Oh, no, just
yeah. So we have 5 different buckets where things happen. Sort of 5 sections of our. I guess you could call it an API or our framework for handling data and business logic. So Redux kind of simplified that a little bit. We still have the central store. Everyone listens to this data store. Instead of having just a dispatcher, we still have a dispatcher, but we kind of use reducers, which are essentially functions inside the store that manipulate state, and then we have React components and action creators that magically talk to the dispatcher. It uses four squares instead of 5, so it's obviously much better. Now, who can guess where this picture is from? This is from the Vue docs. And as you might notice that there's a lot of similarities here. We have a view that talks to actions, which then talk to state, which talks back, and the state is like our store, and it talks back to the view. And obviously, Vue is much better than Redux or Flux because it has 3 circles instead of 4. So that's obviously a huge improvement, but deep down, it's still exactly the same thing. You have a central data store. You have views that declaratively render from your state. They don't do fancy DOM manipulation. They don't try to do anything really weird. They just react to state, render themselves, and if they want to do anything, they talk back to the store so that the store updates itself and triggers a re-render, right?
It's almost like MVC.
Yeah, it's almost like MVC, exactly. But I think MVC that's a very old concept from 2010 when we had Backbone came out with MVVC. This is now just I guess it's a VSA, VAS, SAV, I don't know. I don't really know if they named this concept. It just kind of became very popular. So we have this. In Vue, I'm not going to show you any Vue code because I don't have it on hand. But the way Vue works is you're still building everything in components. What I like about React personally is that it kind of mashes everything about a component together. You have the template, which is your render function. You have the CSS, which is your CSS in JS or actual CSS style sheets. And you have some of the logic that goes into the component body. With Vue, you have single file components, which are split into a template, the component, and the styling, the CSS. So it all still lives very close together, but it's kind of more separate. You have to jump through a couple of hoops if you want to do anything. The way when I first tried Vue, my impression was that it's essentially like a mix between React 13 and Angular 1. Actually, let me try to show you an example so you have a more plastic understanding of what I'm talking about. I do have a Vue component that I was playing with. Let's see if I remember what I called my repository. So this is the problem with having too much stuff on GitHub, is that you can never find what you're actually looking for. They call it the vortex? No. Maybe I forgot to even push it to GitHub. That would be terrible. But let's just find a random view component. View single file component. There we go. Straight from the docs. So this is what a component looks like in Vue. Why is that scrolling so poorly? See, it's terrible. Why would docs try to hijack your scrolling? Because they have to be super fancy or something. Anyway, you have your template. This is very similar to your render function, and it uses handlebars, if anyone remembers how to use that, to automatically tie this greeting part to this part where the data function is returning greeting. And then it has some scoped styles that make it look pretty. This probably looks very similar to you to, like, data is essentially our state in the component itself, and we can add a bunch of functions here, and I think you also can define actions and a bunch of other things. But basically, it's almost the same as React, except instead of using ES6, it's using this mix between ES5 and Vue files, and I think they said that their design principle, the main design principle, is that they want to be ES5 compliant. So they obviously invented Vue files that have a bunch of stuff that isn't ES5 compliant. So you still have to use a compiler, but you can't use ES6 classes to define your components, which I think is silly. But it uses slightly different syntax to do the same thing as React. Let's go to the next example. Who can guess where this image is from?
Angular.
Yep, exactly. This is from Angular. And again, you have templates, which are very similar to components. Actually, you have components with templates that are automatically bound to the template, and you have something called an injector, which my understanding is very, very similar to your global data store, and this is just something that lives outside, and I'm not sure what it does. But basically, you're still using the concept of let's break our app into components, let's keep our components isolated, let's give them some sort of global or near global access to state, and let's have all of our components react in real time to state changes. Very similar thing. For Ember, I couldn't find a good image of the Ember data flow on in their docs. I'm not sure why they don't have it, but they do have this headline somewhere, which probably sounds very familiar to everyone who uses React. The idea is that you have a global data store, which is a single source of truth for your entire app. So that if you know the state of your store, you can replicate whatever your user is seeing. Now, I haven't personally tried working with Ember or with Angular. So if anyone here has, raise your hand and tell us a little bit about if it feels similar to React at all. Nobody here has used Angular or Ember. Wow. There we go. A couple of people.
I guess I used Angular 1, and it didn't feel very, I used 1.6. And so I used components, because I want to use components.
Yeah.
And then I even put Redux in, just to make it more like React. So it felt really close. Nothing that different.
Yeah, exactly. Anyone tried Ember? And was it similar to React?
It's very strict about how you do things, but
yeah, because Ember uses the whole convention over configuration idea from Ruby on Rails, I think.
Yeah, it's also the last I tried it was 2014. It was bidirectional data flow.
Yeah, I think they don't have the bidirectional data flow anymore.
They got rid of it.
They got rid of it because, as a lot of us found with Angular and with Backbone, it causes a lot of problems.
Yeah, and with Ember, I noticed there was a lot of magic going on, and debugging was a lot more difficult.
Yeah.
So it's less scalable.
Yeah, it's less scalable, but it's.
But Glimmer is supposed to be very cool, and
I haven't tried Glimmer.
And it's going to run a WebAssembler.
Okay.
Which would be the first they're like thought leaders, and so that's why it's good to pay attention to them.
Yeah. Actually, I haven't played with the WebAssembler stuff yet, so I'm not sure, but it's supposed to be a lot faster, right?
So it sounded like you tied in Backbone with bidirectional data flow.
Yes, which is incorrect, I know.
Cool. Because the only way that I used Backbone, in a sane way, was a single directional data flow.
Yeah. I still work on a pretty huge Backbone application at my day job. And one of the worst things we ever came up with was that we weren't very careful about using a unidirectional data flow. So now you click on something and a bunch of things just kind of start happening everywhere. And it's basically impossible to keep track of what's going on. We actually have a bug that we haven't been able to figure out in almost 2 years, where in some cases, but not in all cases, a user gets into a state where a view that is no longer rendered on the page is stealing events from the view that is rendered on the page. So the user we have notifications firing, and the user gets notifications that something's happening, but they can't see it because the displayed view is not hearing those events because a view that is already out of the DOM is stealing all the events. And I'm very happy that that is not possible in React. But you can get into fun situations like that with Backbone. But what I do like about Backbone is that if you were very, very careful about how you wrote it, even back then you could essentially get most of the benefits of React. It wasn't as fast as React. It did manipulate the DOM directly. But you were able to if you were very, very careful, you could build a component that behaved as a component and got its data and rendered itself. And you could do it as, you could make the renders purely representational of state if you were very careful. But obviously then team members get involved and you get a lot of, oh, hey, I'm just doing a transition. I'm just going to use jQuery.animate. Why wouldn't I? Or, oh, so in this case, why would I bother with state? I can just jQuery.hide those couple of elements. It's very quick. It's a simple operation. And suddenly you don't know how to debug your own app anymore. And that's sort of the thing that all of these frameworks are trying to save us from. They're trying to force us to use sane principles that I'm sure on the backend or on the OS level were probably figured out somewhere in the 70s or 80s. And they're just now trickling down to us web developers who always like to reinvent things and make everything from scratch. Has anyone noticed that the browser has started becoming your OS?
It tries.
It tries very hard. Like if I watch my girlfriend use a computer, the only time she leaves the browser is if she has to do something for work that involves Word. But otherwise, like Netflix is in your browser, all of your friends are in your browser, all of your chatting is in your browser. Pretty much everything that a normal person who's not an engineer does is in your browser. Even my ops team at the day job, all they use are Google Docs. They never leave the browser at all. But anyway, so what's going on here? Basically, all of these framework developers discovered that we as engineers are very bad at making sure that we follow good sane practices. It's very easy to say, oh, this is just something quick. I'm just going to do it once, and it's going to be super quick, and it's not going to bother anyone. But then your friend does that, and your coworker does that, and future you does that, and then future you does it again, and all of a sudden you can't really. It becomes very hard to track everything. So what a lot of these, or I would say most of these frameworks are built around is this idea of a couple of basic concepts. You want to have a global data store. Having a global data store that is a single source of truth for your entire app is very helpful in it's very helpful in making sure that your components can communicate to each other. It's almost like having a central bus or something like that. Because has anyone experienced the problem of where you spend a month building something and you build this beautiful architecture and it's all great and amazing, and then your designer says, you know what if we move that button from the bottom of the page to the left top of the page? And with if you're using a central data store, you say, oh, cool, yes, I'm just going to take that button, move it somewhere else, and because my business logic is not tied to my view hierarchy, I can just rewire it to take data out of the store and some functions, and you have this almost like an API for your button. In Angular, one of my biggest problems, or maybe even in Backbone and probably in a lot of jQuery-based applications, you suddenly are faced with the problem of, okay, I moved that over there. Now I have to pass the state all the way down from the top down to this button, and I have to pass the callbacks down to the button. And here I have an entire chain of 10 or 20 components or elements that were previously taking a property or a callback only just so they could pass it all the way down to the button. So you have to change all of those as well. So suddenly what to your designer looks like a very simple change of just moving a button from one place to another involves almost re-architecting your entire application, right? How many of you have done that before, where you just change one button and you're suddenly re-architecting almost everything? Every time they redesign, exactly. So if you're using this approach from the modern frameworks, you would have your business logic completely decoupled from your view, so you can completely redesign your page without actually changing how the data store behaves, because your view is just an expression of your state. So the way you manipulate your state doesn't have to be tied to how you do your view. They can be completely separate. Now, obviously, there are problems with this as well, where it's very easy to get sort of, I don't want to say distracted, but enticed maybe, or what I find a lot of, especially beginners to React and Redux and all these things do is they try to put too many things into the global data store. And then you suddenly end up with a store that has too much stuff to manage, and you are essentially at the same problem as you had before, where changing one button requires re-architecting a lot of things because it's tied too much to the store. So I don't know if I have a good rule of thumb to follow with not trying to... I don't know if there's a good rule of thumb. I think it's just something that you have to try a couple times and burn yourself a few times. But in theory, the basic idea is that your data management is completely decoupled from your view management. So that's one thing. The next thing is that a lot of these frameworks, or even most of them, treat components as first-class citizens. And maybe I think React is probably the best at this, at least from what I've seen, where what I really like about React is that you can basically, you write your HTML in your JavaScript. And it looks kind of funky at first, but I'm sure we're all kind of used to it. But have you ever thought about how cool it is that you can just take a piece of HTML and assign it to a variable or pass it into a function as an argument and just do all these things where your HTML, which is the main thing that your UI app is producing, is directly manipulatable by your logic. You don't have to go through this spiel and dance of, okay, I want to change that, so I have to change my data, then I have to go into the template and change the template, and the template re-renders itself and all that stuff. You're just like, oh, this is a function, and the function returns some HTML. And I think that's really cool. It's a very powerful concept that I think we're going to be exploring how powerful that concept is for many years to come. It's almost like if you remember the first time you started using functional programming, or when you came, how many of you have used languages other than JavaScript before JavaScript became a thing? Awesome, almost everyone. So you know how cool it was when you suddenly could treat functions as normal things in your in your app. You can just pass them around. You can say, hey, when you're ready with whatever you're doing, just call this function. Or in the case of JSX, it's like, hey, when you're done doing that stuff, just give me some HTML and I'm going to do whatever I want with it. And that's kind of cool. You can really go into your UI and get your hands dirty and manipulate things and move them around. And I personally think that React is the best at that. The others kind of still try to keep you separate from it. You still want to, kind of keep your distance from templates. But I don't know. We'll see who wins out in the end. But a lot of people, like my CTO, for example, really prefers Vue because he says that it's a lot easier to pick up because you don't have to relearn how to do everything from scratch, which is both true and a problem, because I think that the old way of doing things was not that great. It's kind of crazy that if you want to redesign a button, you have to go to 3 or 4 different files that you need to change your CSS, you need to change your logic, and then you need to change your template. Whereas I just want a function that gives me a button, It's a button. It's always going to be a button. I don't want to change a million files to change a button. So that's another basic concept, is that components are really first-class citizens, and you can really think in components and split your app up into logical pieces instead of having kind of to think about everything at the same time. The next one is this stateful rendering approach, where I already mentioned this a couple of times, but the idea is that to reproduce exactly what your user is seeing, all you need to know is the state that the data machine was in, or I like to model them as state machines, and I don't have a good picture for it in this presentation, but if you turn around, there's a picture from the workshop today where we were kind of modeling the app that we were building as a state machine, where you have these states, and then you have reducers which represent arrows between states, and you just say, hey, do something, and your app goes into a new state. Oops. So with stateful rendering, you can kind of always know what's going on, but you already know that. And then you usually have this action dispatching as well, where the benefit that gives you is that you have this public API for do a thing in my app, and you just call it as a function, and stuff happens, and your entire UI reacts, and you're never rendering anything stale. And that's kind of cool as well. So what's the benefit of all this? Does anyone know why do you like the React? Why do you like the React approach?
I just think it's awesome. Like, it's fast, it's easy to use, everything makes sense, especially like the components are extremely reusable, so you don't have to write anything over and over again.
Exactly. Yes.
I would say, although I've written an application entirely with jQuery and jQuery templates, it's blazing fast. The great thing about React is also blazing fast, and for the first time, the true promise of components actually being able to be portable is possible.
Yeah.
And I think it forces you to think in the same way that web pages actually are rendered. I mean, web pages essentially use something like the way React works. You have to think.
Yeah, exactly. Where it's just one page and it renders, and yeah. Does anyone remember building web pages on the back end? Everyone here always done web apps. So we kind of already had relatively similar concepts on the back end. You had your database, and you pulled data from the database, and then you constructed some HTML, and you put it out on the page. And everything was very stateful. There's no concept of a moving piece on a web page. It's just static HTML. But anyway, the main benefit of all of this is that you can kind of always understand how your app works. You can think about the state machine separately. You can think about how the view reacts to the state machine, and it becomes relatively easy to track what's happening. That also makes it easier to debug. I'm sure a lot of us have experimented with time-traveling debugging in the Redux DevTools, where if you have a sequence of steps or a sequence of states from the user, you can just step through them and see what's happening. And you can save them, and you can replay them later. A concept I've been thinking about but haven't really tried yet is implementing something like background history. So if I had a user who complains that something didn't work, I would just go into every time that Redux triggers an action, some sort of middleware could, for instance, report that action to the backend, save it in the database, and then magically you can always reproduce exactly what the user was seeing, which is kind of cool, I think. Probably also very intensive for the network if you try to save every action to the backend.
There are tools that do that in JavaScript, but they just sort of take all the actions that are happen on the page.
Yeah. I haven't had a chance to play with those because in my day job we use Backbone and it is impossible to do that for Backbone. But I think it would be really cool. Has anyone here used something like that before? You have?
Yeah, there's a tool called LogRocket that's actually built around here that basically does that. And it also gives you like the ability to kind of like visually see what you're doing, like
Oh, that's cool. Yeah. So then, because everything is, or maybe I switch these around. Maybe the first thing should be that everything is isolatable. So, what I like about components is that you can kind of isolate pieces of pieces of your app become almost like a sub app that you can work on. And what that means is that you don't, in theory, if your APIs are well designed, you don't have to understand the entire app that you're working on. You only need to understand the small piece that you're working on. And that's kind of cool too, because it means that it's easier to collaborate with the rest of your team. You can kind of say, hey, you are going to build our buttons, you're going to build our list items, and so on. And everyone can work separately, but then when you put it together, it just kind of works. And I think that was sort of the pipe dream of object-oriented programming way back in the 90s or even the 80s, where their idea was, we're just going to have teams and we're going to give each team a object to build, and we're going to agree on what the connective layers are, and everything is just going to work. I don't know if it ever works out exactly like that. Abstractions are very rarely so perfect that you don't have to understand what's going on at all. But in theory, with components, we can eventually get there where you can build components separately and then just put them together. And what I like is the huge ecosystem of components that we're building around React, where instead of building everything from scratch, it's almost like jQuery plugins of old, where you get this thing from the web that somebody made and it's already styled, it's already prepared, it already knows all its logic and stuff just works. I don't know if, I'm pretty sure other frameworks than React probably have similar concepts, but I like the idea of somebody else doing my work for me. As I already mentioned earlier, what's also really cool is that because you have these components and because you have the global state and stuff, it's much easier to refactor your pages, because it's almost like building your own Lego pieces and moving them around to build a different house. When you have a house and it's pretty cool and your designer doesn't like it anymore, you just tear it down and you use the same bricks and you build a new house. And as designers like to do that probably almost every month, you can also follow along and just do it with them. I've also seen these really cool concepts that I don't know if I've seen a lot of people use them in production, but there are apps now or processes where your designer designs something in Sketch and just exports it into React components. Has anyone played with that before? I can't remember what it's called, but there's a tool, I think, built by Airbnb, where a designer uses Sketch to design your UI and clicks a button and it gets exported into React components.
I use Zeppelin, but
Yeah, there's a reverse app. There's an app called React Sketch app that does that in reverse.
Okay. That's nice. But isn't there something that does it in the Sketch to React?
I think they're also releasing that very
Okay.
They kind of released a super beta version. One developer from React Beta recently was there. It's trying to do the other way. So they
Okay.
get the full
Nice. And that is
So what are the names of those?
React Sketch app and something with a U.
Yeah, let me find it. The creator actually proposed a talk at.
opposite of React Sketch app. Let's see if they have good SEO. They do not have good SEO.
It's dangerous.
It's page draw.
Page draw.
Yeah. I'm sure there's multiple solutions of this stuff. But page draw is one.
I don't know. They are.
Good JSX?
Is that the one
I-
you're thinking of?
I'm not sure. I just heard of it existing. Well, that's not a good sign. There we go.
The other one I think is the Airbnb app where it's React components to sketch files.
Yeah, that is way too complicated. Let's see what this does. Okay, so they're designing a thing in Sketch. Let's see. That is a really good movie. I still don't understand what it's about. Just life. Yeah, and of course, Quentin Tarantino's obsession with feet. Has anyone ever noticed that whenever a Quentin Tarantino makes a movie, there's a close-up of a woman's feet? Yeah. There's always women's feet in his movies. Also a lot of blood. Okay, so I guess... this demo is going way too slowly. Oh, there we go. That was the page. So they designed it in Sketch, and then some magic happened, and they have the same Pulp Fiction running on localhost. Cool. Okay, so it does exist, and I'm not sure if it's released yet. Oh, it has pricing. I don't like that part. Actually, it has a pricing page that you cannot click on. So I don't know how serious they are about being a startup. But there's a tutorial, and I guess this goes in the other direction, right? Where you have React components and they go into Sketch. Yeah. So all of these kind of things are coming our way. I think they're going to be more and more popular and more easy to use. And somebody asked earlier if it makes good JSX. I don't think it matters, because if it's good enough that I don't have to look at the JSX, why would I care what it looks like? I want, as an engineer, I much prefer focusing on the business logic and on the state machine than I do on whether something has one div or two divs. Unless, of course, it comes down to performance, and I am the kind of person who really needs very good performance, which is actually very rare. Has anyone ever noticed how, as engineers, we like to pretend that our apps are as big as Google and that we need to have as many performance optimizations as Google does, and actually our N is like 10? Because the thing is that if you have 10 things that you're showing, it doesn't actually matter. You can have complexity of N to the power of 100. It's still going to be plenty fast. So, worry about optimizing what needs to be optimized. It's like Ryan Florence likes to bitch on Twitter about people complaining of putting fat arrow functions in callbacks directly into JSX components. If that's your performance problem, you have much bigger issues and much bigger fish to fry. But anyway, that's basically what I was trying to tell you today, and somehow I managed to talk about it for 40 minutes. That you want to, it doesn't matter what framework you're using, it doesn't matter what framework you're going to be using in the future. Flame wars are fun, get into them, but know deep down that all that really matters is that you know that you have to use a central data store, treat components as proper first-class citizens, and think about your apps in components. Render things statefully, don't go and manipulate things without changing state. and think of actions as like a global API to your global state. And as a result, your life is going to be better, and you will develop things faster and be able to grab a beer after work or after this talk. And yeah, the reason frameworks exist is because while everyone is trying to achieve this same goal in different ways, everybody knows that their way is the best way. So here we know that React is the best way and all the other ways suck. But if anyone makes you use the other ways, just know that you already know how to use them. It's just a different syntax.